All right, welcome back to the Growing Band Director Podcast. This is episode number 158. I'm here with Tiffany and Patrick from Band Meets Strings podcast. Really happy to be with you guys and talk about all things band and all things strings, or at least a lot of things band and a lot of things strings. So thanks so much for being here. Will you guys tell us a little bit about your podcast, your mission, and what you do?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having us here, Kyle. My name is Pat Dandria. I teach out in California in the Bay Area, as well as Tiffany. And I have been teaching for 15 years now, but 3 years ago, made a switch to a middle school level that included not only band, which was heavily my background, but also a very, very large strings program. And I came into that experience with no experience myself actively teaching a string program. So after a year of trying to figure it out and doing the best I could and learning on my own, Tiffany being a big resource of that, I reached out to her and said, I have a lot of questions. I'm sure a lot of people have a similar background, and she is an expert and incredible teacher in all things, but certainly in the string world. So reached out to her and said, hey, why don't we talk about this stuff and maybe other people can benefit from it.
Yeah, and I'm Tiffany Oponicelli. I also teach out in the Bay Area. I teach high school string and symphony orchestra, and I am thrilled to be here. Thanks for having us, Kyle. And I'm a little bit of a fraud on this podcast. I have much less band directing experience than everyone else. I'm very squarely in the orchestra world, but it's been really fun to sort of think about the practice through the eyes of Pat. Pat has a lot of background in high school band and through an incredible program, but I think sort of seeing him work through middle school orchestra for the first time has been really thoughtful for me too, to sort of think about my own practice. So there's so much in common with bands and strings, and there's also just so much that is different. So I think it's been a fun project.
Yeah, 100%. One thing I love that you guys mentioned is, and this is in all areas, at least in music teaching, I think, is that whole of find an expert. You know, for you, it's Tiffany. For my wife, when it was starting jazz band, it was Terry White. Like, find somebody who knows what you don't know. Like, people always think they have to know everything. No, you just need to find somebody who can help you.
Totally.
Yeah. And I think in our profession, there's so much, I don't know, for me, especially when at the beginning, Tiffany and I knew each other as friends and colleagues kind of casually before we really started to engage in this way. But there's sometimes this perceived wall of like the people that know a lot, or the people that have the program, or the people that are the name, are kind of this barrier between you. And in every experience I've had, the moment that you open the door, they're just so willing to kind of give. I think that's such an amazing part of our profession and community we get to be in.
And specifically strings, I think a lot about how strings feels extremely gated in an extra way, where I think if you don't have native string experience, I think it becomes that much harder. So it's been great.
I think one other thing people can do when they're looking for content, you know, if you just find the search bar in your podcast platform and you just put in cello or trumpet or, you know, sleep or anything, you know, you can find all of these, you know, and the great thing about podcasts, it's like you can step into somebody's session, right? And in 30 seconds, if it's not for you, you can exit and you don't feel bad about it. You don't have to, you know, you can really tailor it to what works really well for you. So I'm really glad that all three of us are kind of in this podcasting space and all that. Can I ask a random question before we go to the next thing?
Yeah.
What's another music podcast that you guys really like that's not yours and is not mine?
Oh, you know what? You go
ahead,
first.
Tiff.
I'm going to go. I love Rishikesh. I got to say it again. I love Rishikesh Hirway's Song Exploder. It has long been one of my favorite music podcasts. It's not necessarily music education related, and it spans all genres. But the way that he edits his podcast, he interviews a musician about a specific song, and then takes the song apart and talks about each part of the song and sort of their thought process through. And at the end, plays the full song uninterrupted. And I've just long really appreciated that. It's not at all music ed related, but I get a lot of inspiration from it.
And I would just add, I mean, I think a huge inspiration for, I think the model around how I wanted to talk about kind of our pedagogy piece in our platform was after sectionals. I had been a long time podcast listener, and the first time that I listened to that podcast, I was like, this is just speaking what I talk about every single day in the
Yeah.
way I want to talk about it. And I've been a long time listener to them, and I know a lot of what we talk about. I frame it very much, I think, in the way that they talk about their pedagogy in the band world. So huge fans of the whole after sectionals team.
Yeah. And I think they were like kind of the first, aren't they? I mean, they've been doing it for a long time.
They've been doing it for a long time. Yeah, I would also just give a shout out, though they just wrapped their podcast a few years ago. But one of the kind of pioneers again in this world was the Amused podcast, Amuse Ed, which is a group of California area teachers that, again, just at the end of their week talked about how did things go. And I think it's cool now that we're living in this era where there is a lot of content and opportunity out there. And I think, like you said, Kyle, you can check it out, and if it's for you, you can really dive in. And if you kind of check it out and get something or want to log off, it's so easy. So it's a great part of our platform.
Yeah. And it can be so isolating being in schools, right? I mean, if you're lucky, you've got some colleagues to talk to, but we know it's so different from everything else in the school. And just the ability to connect with other people, I think is pretty awesome. So,
Yeah, I will just
For
share
sure.
personally, in listening to your podcast, because I'm a listener to your show, I just feel like even though we're meeting face to face now, like I know you and I get to kind of share our journey as educators together. It's really awesome.
I will say it is kind of weird. I'll see somebody like once a year at an Allstate and I shake their hand or something and they go, I don't know if you guys get this too. They're like, I feel like we're best friends now. And I like literally haven't seen them in a year, but because they listen, it's like this cool dynamic.
For
Yes, it
sure.
feels very special.
And actually, Kyle, for our listeners, before we get too far, would you mind just telling us a little bit of background just about yourself so that we can introduce you to our listeners as well?
Sure. In actually 2 years ago, February 2022, I just had this sort of calling to um, take my friend Jeff and I, who at the time was a co-teacher with myself, and start a podcast where we just talked about a lot of we had conversations over Zoom and things because he lived an hour and a half away about our program, and we would talk about things, and I'm talking and going, you know what? Both of us have been teaching a long time. I bet you there's a ton of stuff here that people would want to hear and drop in on. So we started the Growing Band Director podcast. My friend Tom Lazat was a mentor of mine, and he always used the Ray Kroc quote from who was the founder of McDonald's, which said, "When you're green, you're growing, and you're ripe, you rot." So that growth mindset mentality was really an opportunity to kind of go, you know what? I'm clearly not the only teacher, music director who wants to improve and get better all the time. So it's really been selfish, right? Because like you get to talk to so many people, and my teaching gets better and better and better through the process, and just getting to connect from people all over the world has been pretty awesome. We typically go weekly when we have a kind of a backlog of content regarding maybe repertoire or things like that. Sometimes it's not only Monday but also on Thursday, but usually it's kind of every Monday morning. So
Yeah, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Growing Band Director, please go check it out. They've got incredible resources. Kyle's put together sort of crowdsourced and also his own repertoire recommendations. And I think it's so powerful to be able to hear people who are, in the field just being able to offer such a great resource.
well, it's hard when like there's so much like how do you people some people say I don't know what to play. It's like, well, yeah, because there's 10 million pieces to choose from. The people who say they can't find anything, those are the people I don't understand. But as
It's true.
as Terry White said one time when we were together, he said it makes more sense when somebody says, I use this for my group and it really worked because of this. So
Hmm.
what
For
we
sure.
try to do as much as possible is we'll take the YouTube video when there's score and sound. So if people are watching, we'll talk about the piece and then we'll listen to the piece or at least a segment of the piece so people can kind of go, nope, or
Yep.
yep, depending on their group at the time. And then if they're watching, they can see the score too. So
It feels like what everyone wants out of a PD day at school, right? Like we wish we could spend our time doing that, but instead we're spending our time learning about the new
other
reading
other things.
initiative or whatever. Yeah.
Which acronym?
Okay, so let's dive into our first topic, which is kind of what to know before entering the classroom, which is really hard, right? I mean, we've all kind of taught things that we haven't done before. So there's so many things here, and I don't know who to kind of take the lead, Patrick or Tiffany. Like Patrick, you've been through this more recently, but Tiffany, you're clearly the string person in the string talent in the room. So yeah,
Yeah, well,
Pat, take it away.
I'll kick things off, and then Tiffany, I'm sure there's a lot that you'll probably add on to this. Well, I think I'll speak from the frame of, the idea of what to know before entering a classroom is a very big topic, but assuming that you've had some classroom experience, obviously my background, and I think Kyle, listeners of yours are likely a background of band. And coming into, as a band teacher, into the strings classroom, I think the first thing that I think is the most valuable is being able to be competent on a string instrument. I'll just speak from personal experience. When I was in college and I took my strings method class, you're like 2 months of how to learn the thing that you have to teach to children, which feels far less than what you actually need. I remember it was horrible at violin and viola. One of our tests was we had to tune one of the viola strings, and I remember I snapped the neck off of my viola, which I didn't think was possible. That's never happened in my teaching career. But I will now say, after having gone through it, that it is very, very possible, even if it's not kind of a natural fit for you. I would say playing an upper string instrument was not like a natural fit for me the way it was in a wind instrument. I'm a saxophone player. I would highly recommend, if you can, to take an actual course of some sort that maybe focuses about teaching. There are many, many colleges and universities and programs that offer something about teaching strings for a non-strings player. I happened to go through Vandercook College. They had an online class and thought it was phenomenal. And it taught me many things, including how to play the instrument, but also how to teach as I was learning to play the instrument. And particularly as a middle school teacher, the amount of modeling that I do in the class is very, very high. And I think if I didn't have the confidence to do that, I would feel very challenged to be effective with my students in the class. I think the modeling is huge. I think the ability to personally understand the fingerboard geography, which as a wind player, and even as someone, I'm not a pianist, but I have a very good understanding of the piano keyboard, obviously. But the fingerboard geography, though it should be logical because it's just, potentially in half steps and whole steps, the fact that there's nothing there and not knowing how to find. I know as a wind player, I was like, I don't know how to tell a kid where to go other than, putting a marker down, which is a tool that they're using. But having that personal experience to be able to do that and then share the things, it's the same again as the instrument you play on right now. The things that when you're playing, you experience, you get to share with your kids, and they're probably experiencing something very similar. So that could be any instrument. It certainly could be a violin, which is what I chose. I chose that because it was the smallest and easiest for me to have in my home, but also because when I'm teaching, it's very mobile and I can pick it up and put it down easily. I would love to be a far more competent cello player. I think the one thing I would say about bass is, while having that background would be really huge, there are just a lot of differences because of the connection between the strings and the finger patterns that I think having an understanding of are critical. But if that was if someone was saying I have to pick an instrument, I would probably not choose bass as the first instrument between all of those. So those are just a few thoughts on the instrument piece itself. Tiffany, do you have anything you wanted to add?
I just want to mention, you guys did just do an episode all on the bass, right? I saw that it came out, I think, in December. So we should check that out.
Yep.
Yes,
it's its own animal for sure.
It is. I learned so much.
It's funny because you say it's like the last one. For me as a band director, it's the first one because we've got upright basses and we have a jazz program. So it's like, here we go. So.
Yep.
Yeah, in some ways, you're right. Actually, coming from band, in some ways, that does seem more accessible. I'm an upper strings player. I was a violist, or am a violist, and I think I honestly, I've said this on our podcast before. I spent the first 3 years of my teaching string orchestra fully not understanding the bass. I was just like, that doesn't sound right back there. Is like basically all I could offer. But I agree with Pat that truly modeling is key. And so if you can take lessons, if you can take a month of lessons on one instrument, that's going to change the game in terms of how comfortable you are with it. I love that Pat took the course at Vandercook, and that's a great example of sort of coming at it from a music ed perspective. But if you can get one instrument under your belt, and I would recommend either violin or viola or cello. The weird benefit of strings is that there's kind of 3 buckets our instruments are in, unlike band where you're dealing with different fingerings, different embouchures across dozens of instruments. With strings, I mean, of course, there's intricacies between each one, but if you can figure out the system works the same for violin and viola in terms of fingering. It's just a different set of strings. And then cello has a different set of fingerings, and then bass is its own animal, and tuning in fourths across as well. But if you can get one of those and feel confident in first position, and be able to have a beginning idea of how shifting works and making sure just that your setup is good, that's going to make a huge difference in terms of how you can model for kids. Pat mentioned modeling for middle school kids. Honestly, modeling for high school kids, I still think is huge. And I think a big part of this also is we are so used to coming into the classroom and feeling like we're the expert and knowing that we are going to be the one who knows all the answers. And the reality is, if you're coming in and you've played a month of violin, there's going to be kids in your class who have been playing since kindergarten, and they are the expert. And so much of this, I think, aligns with Kyle's podcast idea of just being a growing director, right? So you're coming in and your ego is removed from it, and you're coming in and you're excited to model and teach, and you should understand the content, but also using the students in your room who have the experience, I think, is going to be key in a string classroom if you're not a string native player.
So I have so many built up questions from that couple minutes. Can I fire them at you and just see where things go? Okay.
Yeah.
So position stickers, yes or no?
I'm all about tapes. I do not like the ones that are the full sheet sticker. The reason for that is, especially student instruments, sometimes there are just spots on the instrument that are not going to be exactly in tune. Tapes allow you to sort of be really adjustable for each one. And car pinstriping tape is the answer when people ask, what kind of tape do you use? It's all car pinstriping tape. Beautiful.
Modeling. This is huge too. I had a professional trumpet player doing a lesson in my band room, which I didn't work out. It just happened to get, I forgot, Phil Snedeker. And he looked up and he said, Kyle, you must be a fantastic teacher. And I was like, okay, thank you. But he's never seen me teach. He said, well, your trumpet's right there next to the podium. So that's one thing I try to tell people a lot too, is like modeling, playing with, playing for, modeling, not just for strings, but for any band director, I think is huge.
Definitely.
You were talking about taking a class. There's also the quick way to do that. I'm not saying it's as good, but like YouTube is awesome too. And just preparing for this, I've like just looking for string stuff. It's like there's stuff everywhere, right? So, many
good resources that people have made videos for. Just in terms of like watching a bow hold, you can watch it from every angle on a 360 camera now.
It's just awesome. And the last question I had from all this is, you mentioned natural fit, Patrick. Like, so Tiffany, as the string person, right? Patrick, are you offended when I say that?
No, please.
Okay.
Please. That is so accurate. Yeah.
I don't want to offend you over and over again. Natural fit. So like, is it just the size of the kid in the hand where you'd say you're more naturally fit to this instrument, or what other factors are there?
That's a good question. I am less inclined to believe that there is a like true natural fit for things. I think kids should be choosing based on what they're excited about, what timbre feels like it sounds good to them. And realistically, I mean, we all go through this with whenever they're choosing in 4th or 5th grade, they're also just choosing based on what their friends are choosing and what looks cool and how it was advertised to them. I think a little bit more in band, there might be more embouchure reasons why students choose might be better fit to certain things. But if a kid who is the smallest kid in the classroom is really excited about the bass, there are ways to make everything fit for them. So my personal answer is that there's not necessarily a more natural fit within the string instruments.
On that, you just mentioned on the band side of things, my wife, Crystal Smith, and I and Larry Jackson did an episode, I think it was like 80 something, where it was all about beginning band. We talked a lot about the things to look for a kid starting on an instrument. So if anybody kind of like perked their ears up at that, we're not talking about it here, but people can go back and check it out. All right. So what other things do we need to know before we enter the classroom?
Well, I think as a band teacher, something that I value tremendously, and I would say is just the core of my teaching philosophy, is that fundamentals are the key of everything that we do. And that when we teach those fundamentals, we're really as much as we can isolating one specific skill at a time that the kids are able to focus on and to be able to create awareness of. And through all of that, their skill development is built across the board that, of course, then when we get to make the music, they're able to execute those things. And for me, I have a very, very solid repertoire of fundamental exercises that we are using as a jumping off point for all of this conversation in band world. These are probably obvious things to people. Long tones, Remington exercises, scale work, chromatic scales, all of these things, again, the exercise is one of the things, but then through that is the exploration for the kids of how do I actually become a master of each of these fundamental things. And in the string world, I mean, I could have transferred those things directly and said, we're going to play some long tones, or we're going to play a Remington exercise here. But I didn't know whether or not that was the right thing to do. And the short answer is, it is pretty different. I mean, the concepts are somewhat the same in some ways, but I do think the way you get there is pretty different. So I think finding some set of fundamentals that you can use that are not the method book. I think sometimes there's content in the method book that you can use. Like I happen to use, we use measures of success in my 6th grade band class. And in the second book, there's one page at the beginning that is essentially like a warm-up page. And you could use those as your fundamental exercises if you wanted to. So maybe in your method book, you could find something. I will just shout out the resource that I used, which I gained through my course that I took at Vandercook. Lori Scott, along with Bill Dick, wrote a set of books called Mastery for Strings. And that is not a method book the way you would think of like a student-led method book that's kind of like line by line, your essential elements or standards of excellence kind of thing. It's very much the teacher, a kind of teacher-centered approach where there are exercises that students can execute and there are student resources there and there are pages that you can copy for your kids for them to help along. But it's much more of a, here's the exercise, here's all of the things that need to be true for you to demonstrate mastery. And then it actually gives you a little bit of a pathway for you to actually work with your kids. Here's what they would need to do a certain number of times for them to be able to show that, they've mastered this certain set of things. So I found that hugely helpful. It's how I teach fingerboard geography. It's how I start to approach intonation. And through all of that is the thing that our fundamentals are teaching, which is good, healthy technique that is going to support great sound.
Yeah. Pat, thanks for naming all of those. I think the one thing I just want to really highlight, the huge difference in our string instruments is that the right and left hands are doing completely different things. And that it should seem obvious, but actually requires its own set of fundamentals for the right hand, its own set of fundamentals for the left hand. And adding those together, honestly, is a huge cognitive overload for students really, really early on. So it's really easy to get a really great bow grip and then realize once you start adding the left hand that goes completely down the drain. And so really a lot of the fundamentals I think is much less about, at least when I hear my band colleagues and their Remingtons, I think so much of that is about what's the ensemble sound right from the beginning of rehearsal. And instead, I think a lot of the way that I approach fundamentals with strings is thinking more about the individual player and then bringing it back together. And then there are just a couple differences that are, I think, really that have, I don't know, Pat has highlighted for me through the course of this podcast. One is just that the emphasis on 12 major scales in band is something that it does not cross over to strings like at all. Like at no point in my career have I ever asked my string players, even at the high school level, to play their 12 major scales. And I think there is just some instrument differences. And could they benefit from doing so? Probably. But it's different on the string instrument, and it's less about how quickly can they get their fingerings in place and more about do they understand the pathways between half and whole steps. But yeah, that's something that sticks out to me as different.
Yeah, and I wonder if the reason for that is because in the band world, we're also dealing with this thing called jazz improvisation. I guess improvisation in general, but if you want to play on anything, you need to know obviously all the scales to do that. And I just wonder if maybe that's the reason for that. What are the good keys, quote unquote, for string instruments?
Just to add really quick, I would love for my kids to be able to do more improv, and really maybe it's that we need more key comfort in order to be able to do that. But
I would also add just on that the keys piece, something that I think it clicked with me once I started to play is, I mean, if you're playing an open string, if you're starting on your D string and you play a D major scale, well, that same finger pattern is true if you start on your G string and you play a G major scale. The finger patterns transfer so directly. And then if you're playing something that's not on an open string, that finger pattern is going to be the same anywhere you put it there. Whereas as a wind and brass player, I think you're totally right, Kyle, that there's some of this which is just the genre and of kind of the medium. But the finger pattern, the dexterity to be able to move fluidly from one fingering to the next, as a saxophone player in any different key is so drastically different key to key and mode to mode and everything. So I think that's another piece there. Anyway, Tiffany,
that's a good explanation of it. Yeah. But going back to your question of good keys, we always started in D major. D majors is Happyville for everyone. It's a medium-ish string for most folks on all four instruments, and we're able to get there. From there, G, from there, C, and then we go sort of into the F and B flat world once we learn those extensions. So for anything that has those low fingers and extensions, that's going to be sort of the second level. And then I would extend back over to sort of A and maybe E later. But we sort of live in that world. It doesn't, until we get to more advanced high school playing, it sort of sticks in those 6 keys.
I would say the core repertoire of like grade 1, 2 into 3 lives in G and D major the way that B flat and E flat are for band. And then, F starts to extend range a little bit more. So maybe that's your A major in the band world.
Right. That's a good parallel. Yeah.
It kind of reminded me one time I had to start this bass player brand new. It was like I wanted to get her to play a blues right now on the upright bass to try to like hook her to do it. Right. Mm-hmm. So I said, okay, what can I do to make this? Because as a band guy, I'm dealing with guitar fingerings and bass fingerings, and obviously the patterns are very similar, but like it's opposite, right? So moving in fourths rather than moving in fifths. So what I did was do a D minor blues, and I just had her play the roots, right? Because she can play the D, which is the 1, the G, and the A, which are the 4 and the 5. And she was able to play all just the right hand. And when I added the B flat, just for people who know the minor blues is a flat 6 for one measure, it's like it was so easy for her to play that blues just dealing with the right hand.
That's great. All on pits or bowed at all?
No, it was just pits. I think we were playing pits. Equinox. So the bass line goes bum 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 bum. It was like this kind of, but we chose the whole tune, and that lab band that she was in, we did it in D minor. The entire reason was because the bass player could play it. So
I would also shout out, I start every year in my middle school jazz band we do play charts at the beginning of the year, but I mostly am doing improvisation-based call and response. We're just building vocabulary and ear training. And we start with D minor, and then we build into So What. And I do it for 2 reasons. One, because it just lives, on those chords for so long. And because for the bass players who have almost always not had too much flat key experience, they don't start there. And then right after that, when we eventually move into the E flat minor, that's where they have to start to build that. And then that kind of builds that little pathway onto the flat keys for the bass players.
When you do that, do you have them play like the original bass line? Because the bass has the melody, or no?
Oh yeah, no. So I do eventually teach them. I teach the whole band the bass line, and we just do it by ear. Yeah. But when I start, we're just playing patterns in D minor back and forth, and then I start to introduce the bass player to, okay, you're going to play just quarter notes on D, and then quarter notes on D, and maybe A, and then we start to build a 5-note scale, and then I'm just the band is building. I teach the band's bass lines before I'm teaching a lot of other stuff for them. So that's kind of the pathway there. And then eventually when we actually hear the chart, because I'm like, okay, now we're going to listen to this tune. What do you notice? Okay, it's living a lot in these keys, and the kids all want to learn the bass line at the beginning.
And I just do want to mention that this was not planned, but behind you on your right, I think, is the album cover for that Kind of Blue album. Which
that Kind of Blue album.
Good planning there, Patrick.
A very
good
nice
eyes
gift
there, Kyle.
Band. Yeah.
Hey,
That's
and
awesome.
I wanted to shout out also, orchestra gets such a bad rap for not being improv people, not being able to read anything or play anything that's not written on the page. What you're explaining and teaching everyone the bass line and modeling back and forth call and response, that's what the instrument's out for, right? So much of when you've got if I can grab my violin really quick and we can turn this warm up into call and response, I'm playing, you're playing, we're audiating, you're doing a rhythm improv, like all of the things that you use in your jazz band, they totally apply to strings too. And honestly, the string world could use more of it. We could use more of that jazz band energy.
I love it. Can you, Tiffany, can you walk us through like first position, second position, third position? Like for a bunch of band directors who were listening, who were like, wait, I think I probably get the concept, but like, when do you do it? And don't tell us everything, but just like
I'll give you the real short version.
Okay.
First position is when your first finger is playing a whole step away from the open string. That's the gist of it. And that is going to be on violin and viola. Then you've got access to fingers 2, 3, and 4, 2, 3, and 4 being your middle ring and pinky. And then that's going to give you 3 more notes to work with. On cello, same place for first position, but then you have your third finger is going to be a whole step away from your first finger. and your fourth is going to be the next one up. For bass, your 1 and your 4 become the whole step. So you just have fewer fingers to work with. And then the idea behind shifting is that your entire hand, including your thumb and your wrist, are all going to move up to a higher spot and start again there with your first finger. That gives you access to more of the notes that are up on the fingerboard. And there are reasons for shifting that are often a little bit more advanced. So either that you want to access the higher notes on the instrument, but also there are tonal or fingering pattern reasons why you might want to do so. That's the very short version. Generally speaking, first year players is all in first position. I start shifting usually with second to third year players. And I'm just going to name that there is a whole world where some people start their bass players all in fourth position, but that's a little more complicated.
Wow. So what note is that on?
Well, the reasoning behind it, check out our bass episode, but the reasoning behind it, I'm so interested to do this and I want to try it after speaking with our guest Isabel McPherson, but is that you put you're putting their hand in a more comfortable position. And then as you start to talk about, I think my memory is that some of the finger patterns and honestly just the melodic patterns that the lower or the upper strings and the cello are playing are a little more in common with bass, because a lot of times the thing that makes sense for all the other instruments just doesn't make as much sense on bass, and the bass players just have to figure it out for themselves to be able to fit into that, finger patterns, scale patterns, things like that.
And one thing to name physically is that when you get higher on your instrument, the fingers are closer together than when they are lower. And so there is that benefit on bass also where they don't have to stretch as much, especially for small bass players. There's also this thing with string players. They always want to look at what's happening on their left hand. So for violins and violas, usually the scroll should be out to the left, but kids are going to want to swing that in front of them and so that they can see what's happening. So when you start higher on the bass player, that also lets them see versus their hand should otherwise in first position be closer to their eye level where they can't actually see. And anytime you're compromising what you can to try to see, you're also compromising posture and position. So we want to avoid that.
I was at a clinic once with the great bass player. I don't know if you know the name. His name is Rufus Reed, and he's known around the country. I think he's older at this point. But he said, the biggest thing he notices in young bass players is they play in the L shape, right? They go like up first position, and then they just go down the highest string. So getting them into positions where they can move it is.
Yeah, no, I've never heard L shape, but that's exactly right. Kids are really afraid of learning because it feels like speaking a different language when you start to play in higher positions on the lower strings, but it gives you a whole new world to work with.
Patrick, I totally kind of understand. I think your whole like diving into the string world, because for me, it's like jazz guitar. Like, how do I teach good voicings on guitar? How do I teach good bass lines? It's all like, all right, give me an instrument, let me see a video, and then take my teacher brain from there.
It's funny you mentioned that. I had a clinician in with my jazz band yesterday, and the question I asked him on his way out was, do you have jazz voicing resources? Because I'm always looking, and what I am trying to do right now in my career is just trying to take out a guitar and trying to work through things so that I can help the kids. Because what I tell them is, get a good teacher and play fewer strings and try to move less. And that's not that helpful, but if I can actually feel those things out myself, I think I can give them some more information.
So I actually have some information. Like I could do a set. I don't have a guitar, nor are we kind of set up to do it. But if anybody wants to DM me, and Patrick, I'm happy to help you through it. Like, you can teach 3 shapes on guitar, which are super easy. And you can play like 99% of all chords. You just play the 3rd, 7th, and 9th. And it's like really simple to do. They're called shell voicings, and you can find them on YouTube, but I can also walk anybody through it if they have them. Maybe I should a whole thing on it, but I'm not good at it. I don't want to do it. Like, it's like coming to me for sleep advice. It's just not.
I'll take it.
Yeah, it's so good. But you're right. Like, if you overplay all the notes on guitar, I know we're like, it's a string instrument, so this counts, right? But like if
relevant,
you play, it's a G7, you're just playing like your normal G. Well, you're missing the flattest 7th, and you're playing more notes than you need to, and then after that, you probably have your amp turned way too loud, and the entire band is just ruined.
Yes. I'd love to not hear that muddy rhythm section sound of just everybody playing all of the things at once.
Because they have to deal with a piano player and a bass player who are also playing the harmony too. So, all right. One of the things you guys mentioned was tuning procedures. I'm curious to hear about that.
Yeah, well, when I say I didn't have any string experience before my job, that's not totally true. I managed a youth orchestra. I also worked in a program in Massachusetts that had a very, very strong strings program that I was connected to. So I got to see the classroom, and I had an idea of what the tuning procedure looked like. I mean, I knew that somebody stood up and played an A at the beginning, but these were, very established programs combined with like a youth orchestra is a very different experience. And when I got into the middle school classroom, especially I was with my sixth graders, some of whom had never were true beginners on their instruments, because I usually about half of my sixth graders are true beginners. I'm not going to ask one of these kids to stand up and play an A, let alone to actually use their bow to play an A. So that was just something that in my first couple of weeks and months, I was like, I thought I knew what this was going to look like. And now that I've gotten in the classroom and the kids are in front of me, and I realized I didn't think it through that much. So I don't think this is a super complicated topic, because I think a simple system is easy, which is just start to play drones. But typically what we're playing is we're playing the open strings. My preconceived notion was give them an A, which is kind of the default tuning pitch that I think even band people are very familiar in the orchestral world. And then they'll just tune all their strings. And wow, that is so not accurate. They need to hear each of the open strings one at a time. Even in a more advanced class at the middle school level, I do that. I think we have an episode on tuning procedures and instrument tuning, both in the classroom and for individuals, that I'd encourage people to check out. But if you don't think about that thing, it's one of those things that, like, the kids come in, you're ready to start teaching. You've thought about, I came in, I had all of this stuff that I was excited to share with them. And the first thing we have to do is tune their strings. In the band world, I don't tune my sixth grade. I mean, maybe I'm crazy here. I don't tune my sixth graders
You're not
ever
crazy.
until second semester. And I'm really talking about, like, this time of year, as I'm getting into March, is the first time where I'm really starting to ask them to tune their instruments more carefully, and more microtonally. If something's way out, I might help them. They're familiar with, push in and pull out to make adjustments, but we're not doing that. And in strings, if a kid's string is out of tune, they just can't function. And in band, if they're out of tune, they sound out of tune, and it's going to be okay. So if you haven't thought about it ahead of time, it's just something you have to kind of create a little bit of a procedure for yourself, at least.
Ooh, I've got so much to say about this. I hear you. The difference in a string instrument's range of being untuned is just so much larger than a put together clarinet. And the two things. Number one, I use drones with younger students for sure, with the overall goal of having them be able to hear the fifth. So I think Pat's right. We imagine when we go to the symphony, we'll hear the person play, we'll hear an oboe A, and then everyone just magically tunes. For younger students, we have to really train them to hear what a ringing perfect fifth sounds like, right? And so I do that sort of using drones at first, and then we'll play the A drone, and then we'll play the D against it, and we'll hear what does that sound like. And then eventually I transition to using the orchestra as its own drone. So the top half of the orchestra violins will play A, and then they'll stay on A. Everyone plays A, everyone tunes their A. The bottom half viola cello spaces will go to D, and then we'll listen to that fifth across the orchestra. It's the same idea of how strings are actually, usually professional players are tuning themselves across their fifths, but we're using the orchestra as that. And I personally am of the philosophy where I don't use snark tuners or specific tuners, so I really want to encourage their ears. But when I work with young string teachers, you sort of see two versions. One version is everyone lines up for the teacher and they tune every instrument, and 45 minutes of the 50 minutes are gone. And then the second version is they just play the A, and then it's kind of a squeak, squawk, and then it's over. And I think neither of those are particularly effective. I think it does take longer to tune an orchestra than certainly a band, and it is worth it to do so. And with that, the orchestra director has to have some sort of familiarity with using the tuners. For those unfamiliar, there are tuning pegs at the top of the instrument, and then there are also often fine tuners. Fine tuners we let students use, and there's word charts we use to help them understand which way is higher or lower. For every student, really up until 7th grade, unless they have experience with it, I don't really let them use their tuners, because that's how you break strings, that's how you cause a lot of problems. So I think if there's something to learn before tuning your orchestra, I would say make sure you have familiarity with how to best change strings, care for strings, etc.
So you read my mind. One of my questions was, what are those little knobs I always see them playing with? So that's just
yeah.
like
The best way I can explain
version.
it, the ones on top are pressure held for everything except for bass, and so if you turn it quickly, you can easily snap a string. Whereas the ones on the bottom are just moving a slight amount, and so the kids are more easily able to tune.
Do either one of you use like the harmony director or anything like that will kind of adjust things?
I use the harmony director extensive. I would say I use it more often than not. The metronome is always heard in my room, and especially in strings, but well, in both classes, we're using drones a lot. I loved listening to your recent episode with the Carmel teachers. They're just awesome resources they provide as well. And I would say, how much am I using the pure adjustment in the strings classroom? I'm using it less, just because sometimes there are fewer sustains. I don't know if that's always true in the medium, um, but I just don't find that I have to think about it as much. There is something also about the wind playing connection to singing that is not as naturally there for a string player. And as I say that, I also know that string players who sing play far more in tune. So I think all of the certainly check out that harmony director episode if you have not yet, but all of the singing work that you can do to establish this like ear and feeling of just intonation can be true on a string instrument. And like in all the things, if you're able to do that in a fundamental level, when the kids are playing, they're just more naturally finding an in-tune sound that isn't equal tempered, but is actually just using their ears to listen down. So I do use the harmony director extensively. In the band world, I'm using probably the just intonation more frequently. I'm also just hearing that intonation more of a challenge in the band world. Some of that is because, when you play a first valve D on a trumpet, it's sharp every time. So they have to bring it down. And that is just that's not a idiosynchronous kind of challenge for string instruments. If it's out of tune, move your finger up or down and you will be more in tune.
For sure. And I actually, inspired by Pat, recently bought a harmony director. It's in a box next to my desk right now. And Kyle, I was watching, separate from your own podcast, I'd already been watching those Carmel high school videos, and I was thinking about how can we apply this to the string world? What are the things I can take away from this? And then I listened to your episode and was like, this is fantastic. It's more intel on the exact thing I needed. So I'm thrilled, although I cannot say I'm an expert in using it in an orchestra classroom. Come back to me in a year, because I'm very excited to how this can apply to orchestra.
When you mentioned singing, I think it's really huge that if you're in a department where you're dealing with a K to 12 curriculum and you have people who are kind of all on board, it's not about the older teacher of older students telling people what to do, because like that happens and it's not okay. But like if the singing thing is huge from the very beginning, obviously that's going to make a huge difference as you go up. And you mentioned tuning with a really young band. Like I've heard master teachers use the word in tone much more than in tune. If you're providing a characteristic trumpet sound, guess what? The slide's going to be out about that much. And like, it's not going to move very much unless the temperature moves. It's really more about all the things the kid is doing. You have to adjust the tuning of the strings every day. For trumpet, it's like, take it out, put it together, and it should be pretty close. Now, I know not every instrument is the same way.
But sure. You can have a kid show up with a violin that like all the strings are a third out, and there's no way they will succeed in class unless you help them tune that. I also just wanted to say one more thing about singing. I have a personal background in singing. I taught choir actually in addition to orchestra, and my players sing all the time. They definitely sing their drones in the same way. And while we're not using wind or air to play our wind instruments in the same way, there's absolutely a parallel between using your voice and also using the bow, right? And so having them understand how much more air and how that translates to the bow, I think makes a really big difference. I have my own presentations at various conferences have been about solfege singing specifically for string instrumentalists, and I love that idea of giving them that vocabulary. Highly recommend the singing, and I look forward to getting my harmony director involved.
I do want to mention for anybody who's looking for more from that, it was episode like 99, like it was like in the upper 90s, I think. I had one of my good friends is Rob Westerberg. Like, picture the choir teacher that is like your ideal choir teacher. I don't mean to flatter him, but like he's so good. And he came up and we did an episode with him at my house, and it was called Teaching Analytically. And he talked about all the things that choir and band and strings have in common. And it's a fantastic sort of checkout if I'm dealing with the singing part of things. So
I'll go check that out. That sounds great.
Okay, so Patrick has a disclaimer about the trumpet.
I'm realizing after we just talked about our tuning there that I said the upper D on a trumpet. First valve D is sharp. It is not. Band directors, you can relax. It is very, very flat. The low D on trumpet, 1 and 3, is very, very sharp. And there's just as a saxophone player, I was just saying, we play concert F all the time in band, and it's really, really sharp. So to anybody that happens to be a string teacher that's hearing these band things, just know that all of these band instruments have a lot of just idiosyncratic tuning challenges, that when you push the button down, the note comes out, but where it comes out is not in tune often.
So when we're looking at string repertoire, and we're dealing with bowing, obviously we're talking about like up bow, down bow, right? How do you? So it's written in, I assume, some repertoire, and then not written in some repertoire. Tiffany is sort of our like resident string person. Like, how do you decide which one? Like, I've had to do it for my bass parts sometimes, and I literally sit at my desk, like moving my arm, like I think this is the way to do it. Like, is that what you do, or is there more to it?
Yeah, it's an incredibly complicated animal. So yes, there's definitely more to it. The basic premise is that down bow is when you're starting at the frog, where your hand is at the closest part to the string, and then you're drawing that away. That's going to be a down bow. And then up bow is when you're pushing back. And again, it's going to be different for upper strings and lower strings, but there's a push and a pull mechanism. So by default, anytime that you're starting, say, a set of 16th notes or a set of 8th notes, most of the time, that's going to be down, up, down, up. So down is the default starter, but there's just so much intricacies, because in addition to just direction of the bow, there's also where you're starting the bow. So you could start the placement at the frog, you could start in the middle, you could start at the tip. And then there's also the question of how much you're using and the weight and the angle. So the bow itself is this own animal where, like, we look at it and you want to see everyone moving the same direction down and up, but there's also just a lot more to it. And every little decision you make with the bow does change the tone and the sound like a ton.
And when you start with a down bow, it's a stronger sound, right? Not more naturally stronger sound.
Yeah, it's a naturally stronger sound. Yeah, so anytime that you want an entrance that you want it to be undetected, you would start that up bow, and then but then with that comes the intricacies of having all your students place the bow at the right time and in a silent way. Yeah, and then you'll sometimes see there's string groups that you'll see when you'll notice when it looks weird when you play a set of da 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 and you play it starting up bow, it looks uncomfortable. And there's this whole other part where, like, while you're doing that, you have to also be figuring out your left hand, and so it's cognitive overload for kids from the beginning.
As someone who did not go through it at all, when we talk about Suzuki violin, right? That's like when kids learn from a young age, and is it basically all by ear?
A big tenet of Suzuki is that it's by rote. The traditional Suzuki programs do start at a really young age and often involve the parent as well. I went through a Suzuki piano program as a young child, and a lot of it is learning by rote. And then there is this entire curriculum of Suzuki books that have these string solos that are written progressively. And those that's an example, actually, if you want to just learn about bowing, they're very, very well edited in regards to fingerings and bowings. And so if you want to just sort of learn about how that works, that's great. I think Pat and probably you, Kyle, are also just alluding to this idea that sometimes when we receive string music, it's not edited in the way that we might want, especially as non-native string players. So much of it is you have to know the default information. I will say that currently published music is getting a lot better. They have actual string players doing the editing now, which makes a big difference. And I say that a little tongue in cheek because I think string players tend to be a little elitist about, like, oh, who really is the string player? But I think there is music now that's really well edited. But if you wanted to play, say, a Bach Brandenburg concerto published 400 years ago, it is, and you're looking off of the IMSLP score, you're going to get close to nothing. So it's tough.
I'll also mention I think concert band is pretty good for what's written, and I think probably has been for a while. It's changing a little bit, but again, if you look at almost any band piece, do what's on the paper, and 98% of the time it's going to be right. What is not correct is a lot of the jazz band repertoire. And I talked about this in a lot of episodes, like the big long slur or articulation. What is that? A phrase mark? That is not a slur. There's a couple tenets that if people have a band, they're like, you know what? I hear a band next door and they're way better than my band. So how do I make my band better? The notes and rhythms and dynamics are good. I'll tell you it's articulation. And the big things is if you have repeated eighth notes, like on the same pitch, make them as long as possible. No space. If you have a rest, make sure you tongue the note before the rest. Whatever the articulation is, tongue that last note. And finally, if you have running eighth notes, like moving pitches, have the kids write in the slurs from the offbeat to the onbeat. Because when you do that, you naturally will get this do, da, woo, da, woo, da, woo. Well, what they'll do is they'll go da, 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 da. And then once they do that, you have them make it long and they sound like $1 million right away. So when
It's
you
really funny
mentioned
that you
that,
say
that's
that,
what I thought of.
Kyle. They're so well. I think it's actually so parallel to the string world. Like I mentioned, like if I'm playing a Mozart symphony arrangement with my string students, the example is that there's going to be all of these running eighth note lines, and none of them are going to be marked off the string, but they should all be played off the string. And it's one of those things that like you're just supposed to know it. And some editors might put it in now in an arrangement, but in the same way that you're saying the jazz slur doesn't really mean that. The it looks like it's da 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 da. It's actually ya da da da, and it has to be played spiccato, not staccato. It doesn't say it anywhere on the page.
And I think what's huge in that, speaking from a band director, like I grew up in the jazz band line of things. A lot of people didn't. Like if you don't listen to jazz and your kids don't, you're not going to swing. It's not going to sound right. So you have to listen to jazz, and at the very basic level, whatever tune you're doing, take the pro recording of that tune, like the demo recording, and learn it by ear. Like learn all of it by your ear. Have your kids do it too, and then whatever's different from what the band plays on the recording versus what you're seeing, change your printed music to be what the band plays. So if you don't know what you're doing on the jazz side of things, do that, and 100% your band will sound like a whole other band.
On the bowing decision kind of concept there, I think Tiffany's right. It's really complicated because it can be very situational. But something as somebody who just didn't have the background, one, I would just echo what I said earlier. If you just get, I think what Kyle, what you're talking about of sitting at your desk, kind of doing your score study with your arm going back and forth is a huge first step. And I think some people don't do that. It just is like, something sounds wrong and I'm not sure why. But once you actually are able to bow it, it's like, oh, that felt awkward for me. And I'm not even playing an instrument right now. I imagine that's awkward for you. In general, I would say downbeats are down bows in general. And obviously the music is always going to dictate. Where a couple things become challenging is, you know, in band, and I imagine as well as in choir, there is a capacity to your air. You know, you don't have unlimited air unless you're circular breathing, which most of us aren't teaching our children to do in the classroom. So there is some capacity, but there's a lot of capacity. And in a string instrument, the bow is only so long. And if you run out of bow, the only thing to do is to turn it back around. And there are ways to do that and, you know, keep a sustained sound going. But sometimes what you get are rhythms that are uneven that if you don't address them with a bowing, the kids work their way off the bow. I mean, if you're in 6/8 and you have a quarter note, eighth note, quarter note, eighth note, you have that da, 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 da. If you're going down, up, down at the same speed, what eventually happens is those up bows are shorter than your down bows and you run out of bow. So there are ways to counteract that. One of those ways is, well, your up bow has to be faster and your long bow, your down bow has to be shorter. Another way to do that, we were playing an arrangement of When Johnny Comes Marching Home by a very wonderful and great string arranger. And I don't know who did the publishing on this, but everything was marked. We would say détaché, or as it comes, is down, up, down, up. If there's nothing marked, you're kind of assuming this alternating down and up. And what we did throughout the whole piece is we changed everything to a hooked bowing. And a hooked bowing, for those of you unfamiliar, is you're playing two notes in the same direction with a little separation. So we're going down, down, up, down, up, down. And now you're having a symmetrical bowing on every beat while you're still having the rhythm there. None of that was written in, but it felt really awkward at the beginning. I picked up my instrument and said, this feels really awkward. And then I also asked, I have a coach that comes in every now and then to work with our string players. So I checked with her, like, this feels really weird to me. It's the entire piece is built off of this rhythm. Should I just be changing the bowing of every piece? And she's like, yeah. And for her, when she saw the rhythm, she's like, well, no, you're supposed to play that hooked. How does she know that? Because she's a string player. Like, there's nothing there to tell her that there's kind of this wall of like, well, you should know. Well, we don't know. So it would be nice if, as a band teacher, my feeling with so much of the literature, especially for the students, is I just wish more was provided to us. The truth is it's not. And part of our journey as educators is to teach the kids a little bit of that coding system of what do you think would be the best choice here? Another great example of this is open strings. I didn't realize this until I started playing. Open strings generally don't sound awesome because they sound really bright and overly resonant and really, really different than something that is closed, that has a finger down on it. So we try to avoid open strings when we can, unless we're going for that color, like fiddle music. Maybe there's a little more of that open string sound. So on violin and viola, if you use your fourth finger in first position, you're going to play the open string that's right above it. And fourth finger is heavily preferred anytime that you see that note. Is it written in with a 4 over the top of it every time? No, very rarely, other than in really young music. So these are, again, just some of the coding things that what I wish were we could be provided all the information. And the truth is we have to kind of learn some of that coding and then teach the kids how to do it so that when they see it, they can make those decisions without being told every time.
Anything to add, Tiffany?
No, I agree with all of that. I mean, it's just the only thing I would really encourage you to do is, if you can, play through each student's part, especially if you're teaching at a middle or high school level. I mean, the benefit is that there's 5 parts to work with versus the dozens. But if you can play through each part and have an idea of, hey, I'm having trouble with this bowing here, it probably means your students are going to as well. But I think, and obviously that takes time. We are all short on time. But if you have any ability to do that before you pass out music, or even while you're learning concurrently with students, I think you're going to have a much better idea of what they're struggling with.
Well, and it's so much easier if you plan your music ahead of time. I know we can't always predict, but say like for me, I'm sort of an odd duck, and my wife gives me a hard time for this, but I kind of plan when I finish a concert the next day, I'll like plan that same concert for next year, because I kind of know who's in the 8th grade for 11th to 11th. So I'll kind of go, okay, similar concert, different strengths, weaknesses. Here we go. Now throughout the year, and I'll do that all the time. So I kind of always have the next give or take year ready. And to me, it's a little bit of work every couple months. It's not like a big challenge, but then when I hear a new piece, I can go, okay, this other one's out and I'm going to put it over here. And that's helped me a lot. So speaking of
my version of that is just I keep an ongoing list of things I'm excited about for the next year. When I go to a conference, when I'm looking at everyone's repertoire list, when I go to a festival, or if I go to a concert, I am always scouring for a repertoire. I think it's an ongoing thing, but I've never planned the full year in advance for the concert. That's incredible, Kyle.
Well, and it's one of those things too. You might go like, oh, I love that piece. Whenever I get that amazing first year clarinet player, that's when we're going to do that. Until I have that,
and
we're not going
to keep that list with that little note. That's super helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Or features in jazz band. When I have my best player is my Barry sax player. That's when we're going to do, this Ellington tune or whatever. All right. So we talked a little bit off air about literature. And on the orchestra side of things, I know you've got, 400 or so years of stuff. I'm not saying all is playable. And then also really new stuff. So question I have for both of you as string players and string teachers, how do you balance like playing Mozart versus playing something that came out 5 years ago? And obviously they're both important.
Yeah. I'm happy to talk about this. This is probably my favorite topic. I could talk about rep for years.
Let's go.
I think a lot about how we balance the old and the new, and I think there's so much content that I think is really, really valuable. And I don't think a middle school kid. I taught middle school for 10 years prior to teaching just high school. I don't think any kid left that program without playing some version of a Bach-Brandenburg concerto or a Telemann Sinfonia. I think those are just core to the literature to me, and there are fantastic arrangements of them that I think are really accessible and are really important. I will also say I'm a very, very big advocate of diversifying a repertoire, and strings I think are we're both ahead and behind on a lot of things, but just names that come to mind: Catherine Greisinger, Lauren Bronowski, Christian Williams, Katie O'Hara-Labrie. They're all currently putting out incredible content. Yukiko Nishimura, I know, also has band content, but she's unparalleled for beautiful melodic lyrical pieces. There's a couple composers, Nicholas Repetto, Stephen Chin, Ben Snoke, who are all putting out great things. And Rena Ishmael has some fantastic content. She's an Indian American composer that she's writing music that would typically be for Hindustani violin and voice, but writing it in Western notation. So there's fantastic stuff there. My program has worked directly with composers Armand Wimberly and Dion Morales with some of their new premieres and commissions, and they're all just fantastic. I really just challenge everyone to look past the quick filter of editor's choice on Pepper. And there's great stuff there, but there's also so much in the world that is coming out directly from small publishers. A shout out to Murphy Music Press, who I think is doing a great job seeking out new composers to the field. But that's a very long answer to your question.
Well, people need to go back 90 seconds and like write all those names down. That's great.
And sorry, I talk really fast.
At the same time, that's why you listen to music and you keep lists. So you could just, you turn around. Yeah, I could give you, 85 pieces my band could play tomorrow because I have that list and you're not going to remember it.
And everything I just named was kind of in the sort of like middle grade stuff. I'm really fortunate to also get to work with some really high level players. And I think what we get there often is like, okay, well, then they're definitely going to play Shostakovich and they're going to play the full Mozart. And like, I think that's great. To be honest, what we spend our time doing is playing a combination of old undiscovered music and also new music. So we're going on tour next week to New York. They're playing music by Portuguese composer Jolie Braga Santos. They're playing some Boccherini. And so like there's the old and the new there, and they're playing a piece by Vivian Fung, who's a young, well, she's an alive composer right now, and they're also playing music by Spanish composer Joaquin Turina. So like it's just there's so much available there. We're playing a piece by Yasushi Akutagawa, who's a Japanese composer who spent a lot of time working with a lot of the famous romantic composers. It's just there's so much there. Our symphony orchestra is playing a Kevin Day fanfare right next to the symphony orchestra October Whitaker arrangement. It's just there's so much you can do. Pat, want to talk about rep?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to remind myself to write down all of these names that you're saying as well, Tiffany, because so many of them I'm familiar with, but not as familiar as you are. And this is definitely much more in your realm. I would say repertoire in both band and orchestra is just a place where I feel I'm uncomfortable. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. I'm always trying to find things, Kyle. I'm just so grateful for your resources that you provide. But I'll share maybe on the like older music that is you were saying playable. There's so much that is arranged for young musicians where things like key and range, and similar to the band world, are adjusted. I think when I'm planning out my repertoire, I one of the things I'm considering is trying to create a variety of time periods there. And I would say in general, what I'm trying to, for lack of a better word, is like check some boxes of, is I'm trying to every year have kids play some music in a Baroque style. I'm trying to play kids have something in a classical style, especially something that has some off the string technique to it, because from a skill development standpoint, that's really important, as well as just there's a huge amount of core repertoire. I mean, Mozart. And then something in the romantic style that is going to provide a much lusher, richer harmonic language, as well as just all these amazing, big melodies where the kids get to explore vibrato. And then contemporary music, which is a huge, it's just really exciting right now to see all of the music that it has and is currently coming out from composers today. So I'm thinking about those. But when I think about music that is not contemporary, that's in one of those, 3 historic time periods, some arrangers that just pop out, and these are names that definitely you'll find on those editor's choice lists. Michael Hopkins, who I know Tiffany has had a lot of experience working with, writes tremendous arrangements because they are just all of the things that I was complaining about not being written out for kids. He is able to provide for them and just makes it really playable and accessible for the kids. Richard Meyer is a huge name in string publishing, and I think he does great arrangements. Sandra Dachau is a huge name in string publishing and does wonderful arrangements. Roy Philippe does great arrangements. So, these are names that all of those people are writing their own music and have written their own music. But if you're looking for some repertoire that is from, a lot of the history of orchestral repertoire that is arranged, these are people that have written some very great, super playable stuff.
On the band side of things, I'm just going to mention there's an episode that by the time this comes out for me will have come out with Michael Sweeney. And you're talking about doing arrangements of younger band stuff. I mean, I think he's changed music education, both on the jazz side, but also on the classical side. Just taking all this stuff and making it playable for young kids is huge. To me, Pierre Laplante, I know his stuff has been out a couple decades now, but like it's just amazing literature that keeps giving, and there's always more to teach. And I wanted to, this might not be the right time to say this, but I have a string album that I love that I want to make sure people know about. So I don't, yeah. What's the difference between like orchestral string and fiddling? Like, is it a different instrument? I know the style is different.
Physically, no.
Okay.
Stylistically, yes.
Okay. There's an album by Bela Fleck called Jingle All the Way, which is like this. I came across it on during Christmas time, and I listened to it. Like, one of my favorite sax players is Jeff Coffin, because he's like originally from Maine, but he's Dave Matthews Band. I'm a big fan of them too, and so when he played with them, that whole album Jingle All the Way is just like ridiculous. As a musician listening to like country music that's string music, it's so good.
Nice. I'll check it
Very
out.
cool.
Anyways. Well, guys, thanks so much for being here. Nia, any other last minute things we should talk about before we wrap up?
I would just shout out to anybody. I, as somebody who had, at the time, 12 years of experience in music education and in band, and I had taught beyond band, not just in that world, that if you have the opportunity in front of you, whether it's one that you want to take or one that kind of is happening to you in the orchestral world, that I would just encourage you that you can do it. And some of the challenges that are there that we've talked about today are very real, but super achievable. I think I came into my job honestly feeling like I'm going to do this first year, and then I'm going to have a conversation with my administrator about how we can reallocate some staffing to get a string person to teach the orchestra program. And I left my first year going like, I'm enjoying teaching orchestra as much, if not more, than I'm teaching band. I'm really loving what I'm doing. Some of the repertoire we just talked about is a huge part of that. It just opens a huge door there. And if it's something you have a little bit of an interest in, but no experience, you can be highly successful through effort and determination.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I've been thrilled to see so many of my band colleagues. I mean, the reality is that nearly every band teacher is going to teach orchestra at some point in their career. And to see so many of my band colleagues really take it seriously and not just as a throwaway class and really want to learn, I find that super inspirational. And I've been really grateful to get to learn from them through that process as well. And if you can play the instrument, just get the instrument in your hands. That's really the highest encouragement I can give you.
I love it. So, Tiffany, if people want to reach out to you and talk to you directly, how do they do that?
Yeah, I am. You can find our podcast at Band Meets Strings. That's probably the easiest way to get to us. bandmeetsstrings@gmail.com gets to both Pat and myself. And then I teach at Henry Young Gun High School in Palo Alto, and we are at gunmusic.org.
We sincerely appreciate you taking your valuable time and listening to the Growing Band Director podcast. Your students are very lucky to have a band director like you. If you have any suggestions for episode topics or think you have an area of expertise to share on a show with us, please reach out. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your band director friends to subscribe as well. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, our YouTube channel, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening to The Growing Band Director. See you next week.